To all attendees, thank you for making time to join us at this inquiry-based learning webinar. Here are some tips to ensure the best viewing experience for this webinar. Please adjust the volume to ensure that you are able to hear this voiceover loud and clear. Switch off your video camera. Remember to use the chat for technical-related questions or for interacting with fellow attendees only. For questions to panelists, please use the Q&A. Your school's SSOE network could be overstretched. Consider tethering to your personal mobile data for a smoother viewing experience. Refer now to the top of your screen. For the best viewing experience, click on View Options and select Side-by-Side mode. Refer now to the bottom of your screen. During the Q&A segment, closed captions will be used. Click on Show Subtitle to view the closed captions. Selecting subtitle settings will allow you to adjust the size of the closed captions. Please welcome Principal Master Teacher Andrew, the host of today's webinar.
Good afternoon, colleagues, and welcome to this webinar on inquiry-based learning. I am told that we have 300 teachers with us today, and I want to thank each and every one of you for taking time off your busy schedules at school to be with us here today. I hope that you find this session useful to your learning. I would also like to take this opportunity to welcome from CPDD, Mr. Jeffrey Low, Director, English Language and Literature, Mr. Kenneth Lee, Director, Humanities, and Madam Lee Lin Yi, Director, Sciences. We want to thank them for taking time off their busy schedule to be with us here today and to share their valuable insights into IBL. We are indeed very grateful for their presence here today. Why are we having this webinar? It is important to note that this webinar and its purpose is to discuss the big ideas of IBL and look at how it features in our different syllabuses. But as many of you know, IBL is not new. As a system, we have been doing IBL for a number of years. In my subject history, IBL was introduced as a recommended pedagogy in 2013. And for some of our other subjects, you may have a longer experience with IBL. It is good that we sometimes pause and ask why we are doing what we are doing. And especially with the directors here today, we might gain new insights into IBL. And that might help us to design our learning slightly differently. Moreover, IBL has been mentioned a number of times, especially in the context of Skills Future for Educators, or SFED in short. Now, together with 5 other learning areas, SFED's main intent is to support our teachers in strengthening their classroom practices to nurture future-ready students or learners. So a discussion of IBL is timely. For example, how does IBL contribute to nurturing future-ready learners? I've been mentioning IBL a number of times so far, and I believe it's a good idea for us to have a common understanding of what it means. According to the SFED webpage on Opal, IBL can be defined as a constructivist approach to teaching and learning to explore a problem, an issue, a phenomenon, or an idea. Teachers are activators and facilitators of learning through inquiry to achieve intended student learning outcomes. And with the directors here with us today, It gives us a perfect opportunity to discuss matters related to IBL. I know the directors are very ready to engage you in conversation, but before we do that, I think it would be good for us to connect with you at a personal level. Prior to this webinar, we had asked you to take part in a poll to find out how confident are you in conducting IBL. Let's look at the poll results. From here, it is heartening to see that around 60% of you are somewhat confident, about 17% are quite confident, and about 21% of you seem to be not confident. Regardless of whether you are quite confident or somewhat confident, I hope this session will enable you to deepen your understanding and appreciation of IBL. So it's time to engage the directors. Hi, directors. I mentioned earlier that IBL is not new to many of us, and it was a good time for us to engage in the why of IBL. And also with SFED, it is a good opportunity to reiterate why IBL is featured in our syllabuses. So I think the first question that we would like to answer is, why is IBL featured in our syllabuses? Can I invite Kenneth to share his views first? Kenneth, please.
Okay, hi, Andrew. Thanks for having me here. Hello, everyone. Yeah, maybe if I could have the slides, I'll tell you, why the humanities focus looks at IBL, inquiry-based learning, as a key part of our pedagogy. I think definitely one key thing is making sure that students are engaged in the learning process. And I think IBL, inquiry-based learning, has a very learner-centered way of approaching learning by drawing students in to learn as individuals, looking at the question they're trying to answer and looking also at the content, the knowledge that they're trying to gain, but also as social beings. And I think in the humanities, the idea of relating to things in society is very important. So inquiry allows that. If you look at the next box on the top right, various skills are developed through IBL, critical thinking skills, for example, investigation, extraction, analysis, synthesis of information. And a lot of this is actually linked to what they see in society, what they, how a society responds to issues, and a lot of things is also linked to the sources that they would like to find out about. And IBL, inquiry-based learning, encourages them to look at issues, from that perspective. There's also a metacognitive angle to this. Students, we want them to actually be aware of their thinking, their learning, and I think IBL allows that, because metacognition is a big part of IBL. And I think through IBL, we also believe that students learn more about themselves, their own identity, their own beliefs, their own assumptions. Because when you need to inquire, look at things, you are also questioning why you believe certain things. And the last, most important, or very important part of IBL is that it prepares our students for the 21st century. So the curriculum must always prepare students for the future. And I think this is where inquiry-based learning is something that in the humanities and social sciences we believe that students need to have the skills, because social scientists around the world use inquiry to find out the solutions to complex social problems. So that's the reason why inquiry is really part and parcel of what we are training our students to have. Next slide. And when we do scans, external scans of curriculum dealing in the humanities in the UK, US, looking at the IB system as well, We also find that actually inquiry is actually very much part of how these curricula are structured in these countries. That's why, we've also looked at IPL and said actually that's something that we must have. And when we talk to academics and stakeholders in Singapore, they're also telling us, and a lot of them are practitioners in the field as well, social science, and they actually say that this is also what is needed, to train students to actually know what social scientists actually look at, if they are looking at it. And of course, when we go to schools, we also know that schools and teachers, and they are involved in our reviews, also say that actually a lot of times when students inquire, they actually go and find out, they will be much, much more interested in finding out about knowledge and information, and through it build the right skills and values and dispositions. Yeah, that's it, Andrew. That's why the humanities values IBL.
Right, thank you, Kenneth, for that ideas about why IBL and humanities. I think the key points that you raised was the idea of 21st century skills, student thinking, and also the idea of curiosity. I'm just wondering for Lin Yi, would that be the same for science?
Okay, so maybe what I will do is I will first start off by sharing the framework for science. I think essentially curiosity is very much a very big part of learning in math and science. And if you look at the revised science curriculum framework, so this was revised in 2019, you will see there that the vision of science education really is in the 3 INs, which is innovate, inspire, and inquire. So you see inquire right there. Now, IBL is especially important because, as mentioned at the beginning, philosophically, IBL is a constructivist approach. And I think in today's day and age, you will find that a lot of the problems that our students see, or even us as adults that we see in the real world, are interconnected, which is why increased focus in STEM. And I think we can no longer learn things in silos. And hence this ability to actually inquire, to actually ask questions beyond just deep discipline, but also cross-discipline is something that is really important. And hence IBL is definitely one of the building blocks that we need to build our science education on. The other thing to perhaps bring up at this point is in the new science curriculum framework, we talk a lot about healthy skepticism. And I think once upon a time, we used to think that knowledge was absolute. Certain things, when we prove it to be true, it remains as the truth forever, And I think perhaps for some things that we see, it may be so. So some of our math theorems, for example, it remains till today to be proven and not disproved. But in the area specifically for science research, you will find that there are things that as we gather new knowledge, we actually will question whether something that we perceived to be the truth in the past necessarily is still the same today. And this whole process of being able to discern, to actually look at the data that we have, to look at the various alternatives and the claims, that is where IBL will come in especially critical for science education. Now, if you could move over to the mathematics curriculum framework, you will find that for mathematics, right, in the framework, mathematical problem solving is at the core of our math framework. And essentially, as a pedagogical approach, IPL is actually one of the 3 pedagogical approaches that we actually talk about a lot in mathematics. So while we understand that there is a place for direct instruction, there is also activity-based learning as well as inquiry-based learning. And I think one of the things really that we want our students to be able to do is that we do not want them to just be able to solve problems in a very rote learning kind of style. But a lot of times, in order to solve a problem, it starts off by asking the right problem. And that's where IBL will come in, right? Which is the best approach? What do I know? What do I not know? What is the outcome that I want? And hence, IBL also has that place to play in mathematics education. So that is in essence why IBL is important in the math and science classes.
Right.
Thanks, Andrew.
Yeah, thank you, Lin Yi, for sharing with us how it looks like in the science and maths context, I think the key word which or the key phrase which I liked was the idea of healthy skepticism, because it tells us very clearly that knowledge is not fixed. And when students are able to question, when they are able to challenge, then they are actively involved in the learning process. And I think that is one of the hallmarks of IBL. Now we will move on to Jeffrey. Jeffrey, this is just my personal opinion, but IBL is not often associated with the learning of the English language. So I'd love to hear from you. What's the connection?
Okay, I think it's interesting because when we think of IBL, more often than not, you know, in the Singapore educational context, we often think of science. We often think of geography usually. But what I'm suggesting is a broader perspective of IBL, really as a pedagogical approach that's very much, I saw in the Q&A already starting to come in, very much part of one of the strategies recommended in STP. You know, really it's a approach based on active learning, and the student role in learning in terms of student agency, in terms of the 21st century classroom that we all talk so much about, is really, really important. And so these are very, very important aspects of pedagogical approaches that we advocate very much in not just the new EL syllabus 2020, but also in previous EL syllabus, as well as the literature syllabus. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, I mean, I talked about a kind of broad definition of IBL. If you look at this cycle, it's a simplification of the process. If I can ask you now to just keep this at the back of your mind, later on I will try to illustrate this in the context of a very simple example in EL teaching and learning. But nevertheless, really students are researchers asking good questions, investigating these questions and co-constructing knowledge with their peers as well as with the teacher as facilitator, and then trying to communicate these ideas both verbally and in writing. Yeah, so can I have the next slide? Okay, these are the learner competencies identified in the new EL syllabus that all of you have seen. And one very, very important aspect of this is really the role of the creative inquirer, which is what we hope to develop in our students. And if you look at the definition or the statement of what is a creative inquirer, it's almost a kind of definition of the processes of IBL. So for language learning, not just EL, for literature, IBL definitely is one a very important strategy to achieve the kind of outcomes that we want.
Yeah. Right. Thank you, Jeffrey. I think I like that word that says empathetic communicator. English language is moving towards the idea of being empathetic to the situation concerned, and then the other idea of a creative inquirer. So this then makes IBL learning aligned with what EL syllabus outcomes would like to achieve. I think based on the first question that we have had your inputs on, if I may, I can just like to summarize by saying that engaging in IBL enables students to go beyond the content and the key ideas of the subject. More importantly, it provides an opportunity for them to understand how knowledge is constructed in the different disciplines, and in the process, develop aspects of thinking in a more systematic manner. And that seems to be what we all are saying in our different ways. So now that we have an idea of why IBL is featured in our different syllabuses, I think the next question would be, what constitutes inquiry-based learning in the different disciplines? And can I invite Lin Yi to share with us what constitutes IBL in mathematics and in science? Lin Yi, please.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Yeah, so basically, I think if you look at IBL in math and science, the process there is really quite similar. I think in mathematics, we often talk about from concrete to abstract, right? And if you look at basically the process that we are seeing here, a lot of it first starts off with that investigation and exploration. So besides this whole idea in math from concrete to abstract, in science, we also talk about this sense of curiosity and wonder and about observing what is going on around them. So if you look at this stage where they investigate, they explore, they look at things around them, that's when the inquiry starts. And after that, they do some form of sense making. And with that sense making comes some evaluation and reasoning before they can come to either a form of solution or conclusion or explanation for what they have observed. So this process essentially is similar in mathematics and science. And for IBL in our subjects, and I think probably across the other subjects as well, it can actually take a combination or run across a spectrum of teacher-directed IBL to student-directed inquiry. So it could, so maybe it will be easier if I illustrate it through an example. So if we could look at our Sparkle kit. So for our colleagues who perhaps are not in the primary schools, this is something that has been developed for the primary school science syllabus. So it's essentially a hands-on kit. It's a series of 17 or 19 kits that we are rolling out to complement the syllabus for students to do IBL and to investigate with hands-on tasks. So if I could have the next slide. So what it does is it essentially looks at the conceptual flow of certain topics, and it highlights and it is designed to bring out concepts that are either difficult for students to understand or have common misconceptions. So if I could just click the slide. So a possible learning experience that is very teacher directed could be the teacher asking the students, tell me, is it necessarily true that a cone will always give a triangular shaped shadow? And that's when, for instance, the child can actually put the cone shape in and then start turning it around. And depending on the orientation, if he actually puts the base, the round base at the bottom, they will actually notice that the shadow is actually not a triangle. So that's a very teacher-directed inquiry. And it can actually move along the spectrum of a more structured and guided inquiry to, okay, find different pairs of the object that gives you the same shaped shadow. And the students then can then draw some conclusions from what they have investigated and observed, all the way to something that is very loose and student directed, which is the students come up with their investigative task. So this is an example of how the whole spectrum of teacher-directed to student-directed inquiry can look like in science education. If I could have the next slide. So in mathematics, again, we do have quite a lot of inquiry tasks as well. So at the primary level, for instance, again, this whole concept of from concrete to abstract, right? So that's when students can actually observe and look at the things around them, and they could come up with ways to categorize and explain their categorization. So this is a simple example of how IBL can look like at the primary school science level. Yeah. So maybe I will let the rest of the panelists share.
Right. Thank you, Linji. I think you used 3 words just now: investigate, evaluate, and then come to a solution. I think there are different variations in the different subjects. And this would be a good opportunity for us to hear from Jeffrey how IBL looks like in the EL syllabus.
Sure.
Jeff.
Okay, I think if I can try to illustrate this in terms of the EL syllabus, those of you who are English teachers who have seen the EL syllabus 2020, you would have seen this diagram before that attempts to, in a sense, articulate the key processes involved in EL teaching and learning, including CLIPS and accolade, which many of you are very familiar with. But perhaps at this point, I'd like to try and illustrate this through a specific example. Earlier, I had referred to, or I showed a slide with the cycle of IBL. If I can try and just illustrate that with a very simple example. Many of you would have been involved in teaching the expository essay. So if you were to approach this in a classroom, an O-level essay type, most young people today are obsessed with fame and imitating celebrities. Discuss. Those of you who are English teachers, this is a very typical kind of question that, that students will have to deal with in their essays. So when dealing with a question like this, the first step for them to do will be to interrogate the question, isn't it? You know, the who, what, how, where, why of the the kind of question that they have to do. And so a kind of guided inquiry would start this, you know, what do you mean by most young people? Young people where? You know, only in Singapore? And what do you mean, what does it mean when someone is obsessed with something, with fame, with imitating celebrities? Who are celebrities? All these things that in a sense they will have to interrogate, they will have to inquire, right? Subsequently, they would then, I mean, certainly I would organize the class for the students to investigate, you know, the different ideas around this particular question, you know. So really they can collaborate in small groups, investigate the question. You know, it's not just about them. It's also about other young people. You know, could be that they are a particular group of young people that may not be typical of everyone else. Okay, this may be true of Singapore, but is it also true in other countries around the world? You know, so that's something that they will have to do. Okay, then next step, they create. They start formulating their ideas. They start creating presentations for class, for each other, where they sharpen their ideas, you know, where they question one another, you know, these kinds of things. And that's where the discussion is important. Different points of view, you know, from the point of view of different groups, from the point of view of their peers. You know, these are the kinds of things. And the last part of the cycle of IBL, perhaps the whole notion of reflection. Students then think through this process. Metacognition that was mentioned earlier by my colleagues it becomes very important, you know, before they finally sit down and think through how to construct their essay in response to this question. So we can go through the cycle in terms of a pedagogical approach to teaching this kind of process to our students. If you can move to the next slide. Thank you. Right, so in the EL syllabus, we articulate quite explicitly the cycle of learning. You know, that really inquiry-based learning is part of an entire holistic approach where explicit instruction perhaps lay on one end of the spectrum and things like IBL on the other, where knowledge is co-constructed. Students come together to do this really as a class and as small groups. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So inquiry through dialogue, I think this was articulated in the diagram earlier, to deepen language learning, to look at thematic ideas, to look at multiple perspectives. All these things are important. And there's a range of tools you can use. You know, tools like exploratory talk, you know, task framing, talk moves, group roles, all kinds of things. A whole bag of strategies, if you like, you know, that can support this kind of learning. So really, in terms of the possibilities of IBL within language learning and in literature as well, there are a lot of possible strategies that you can explore. Yeah, that's it for now. Thanks, Andrew.
Yeah, thanks, Jeffrey. I'd just like to highlight 4 words that you used. 1, interrogate. 2, create. 3, point of view. 4, metacognition or reflection. And then you use something which I think helps us to see the learning of EL more than just being mechanical, this notion of a dialogue. So I think this again frames what constitutes inquiry-based learning in EL, which in a way is similar to what Ling Yi said just now. And I think at this juncture, it'd be good for the humanities to come in and see how or what constitutes IBL learning in the humanities. Is it just limited to HI, which is historical investigation, GI, geographical investigation, II, which is issues investigation, or would more learning experience constitute IBL learning? Kenneth, please.
Hi, Andrew. Thanks. Yeah, definitely more than just you know, HI, GI, or II. I think this is the humanities inquiry approach, and I think if you're a humanities teacher, you should know this pretty well because you've been using it for quite a while. I think what it actually shows at the top are the elements for inquiry. They're question-driven, evidence-driven. You know, there's a knowledge construction, and there's always reflection. And I think in some ways, these are the things that I have also heard from the other subjects that you do have as well. You know, I think these are the key constituents of inquiry. What you have below on the left-hand side will be the process of inquiry. And I think humanities teachers will also be very familiar with this. You have the sparking curiosity, you know, gathering of data, exercising reasoning, then reflective thinking. And I think I want to emphasize also that it's important for really this process, you know, to be done, you know, as a whole. I think sometimes what teachers do is that they take certain parts, you know, and they focus on those, and they don't actually complete the cycle. I think then that actually means that students, you know, don't go through the whole process, and they don't exercise reason, or in many ways, sometimes they don't do the reflective thinking. So actually the process is important. Of course, how much time you put spend on the process is, you know, is something you can determine. The other one, the last part is culture of inquiry. That means actually inquiry, as Andrew has mentioned, shouldn't be done, you know, once a year, you know, because, you know, I have to do this project, you know, that is about inquiry. I think it should be a culture of inquiry that actually we are using to teach different knowledge areas, you know, different topics, you know, and of course build skills. I think it's important that the teacher builds this culture of inquiry, you know, within the class, humanities classroom. Next slide. What we have actually done is when we looked at inquiry, you know, with our different curricular reviews at the humanities branch, there are a number of things that we have found out. Now, the use of inquiry is actually has grown, you know, over the years. It's something that I really want to thank the educators, you know, the teachers, HODs, the teacher leaders for growing, you know, the skills, the competencies, the practice of inquiry. But I think what we find out is that, of course, there are still different factors and clouding teachers' judgment about whether to use inquiry in the classroom. Some of this is actually linked to the time needed to teach content and skills. And so sometimes people think that I don't have enough time, I can't do inquiry, you know, let me just focus on content and skills. And of course, another part of that, you know, is students' readiness and attitude towards IBL. And sometimes teachers think that certain students are more suited, you know, for inquiry-based learning and not other students. So that's a misperception. I think moving forward, I think what we will definitely try and do at the humanities branch is continue to build on the enablers, the curriculum resources, the PD, the NLCs, you know, network learning communities that help build teachers' skill in the use of IBL, and of course creating resources that allow teachers to stretch inquiry-based learning. The other things that we want to do are strategies to support inquiry-based learning. I think this shouldn't be new to humanities teachers as well. Socratic seminar, structured academic controversy. But there are other ways that we can actually help students really access IBL. And I think one of the things that we have come up in our reviews to actually see is that actually the ability to structure and scope and maybe scaffold inquiry so that's suited for the students, and the students are actually accessing inquiry, you know, at the level that they can. But definitely also building a culture of inquiry is something that we do need to focus on as well. Next slide. I think, and you can actually click on to the other things so that, so actually what you see is that this is a history inquiry question. Did Singapore have to fall to the Japanese in 1942? And of course, for some of us, it's a no-brainer. Yes, you would have fallen, you know, to Yamashita. But I think what we have in the humanities is really questioning the assumptions. And why? Because we look at the sources, we look at what's out there, and we revisit the issue, you know, and we ask the students to revisit the issue. And I think what we are trying to make sure that we spark their curiosity. We ask them to gather evidence from different accounts, right? Different historical sources. Then we ask them to exercise reasoning by, after you gather, you talk to each other, you know, what kind of conclusions can you draw? And of course, you know, we come back to let the students think about not just their conclusions and to present it, but to be able to think about their process of thinking. Was I thorough? Did I look at all sources? Was I being objective, you know? And how do I come up with that? And I think this whole process is important because in some ways, in many ways, this actually reflects the way that we do work, you know, in the real world. If we had to think about an issue, this would be the inquiry process. Andrew, back to you.
Yeah, right. Thanks, Kenneth, for using the example. You use the word no-brainer, and sometimes it's not whether the issue is settled or not. It's what else can we find out about the issue. So I thought when you mentioned the process, looking at what also the other two directors mentioned, it seems to be question driven. That has to be a starting point. It has to be question driven. Students have to be given an opportunity to go and find out data, whatever that data means in the different subjects. They have to then interrogate it, interact with it, and come up with some sort of an understanding and represent that understanding. But more importantly, there must also be an opportunity for reflection. So this would constitute IBL. But I thought you raised one more issue, which I think is very important, and that is a culture of inquiry. If we go back to the definition of IBL in SFED, the word facilitator was used. So the question then becomes, what does facilitating IBL looks like in our different subjects? You know, what is the role of a teacher? And I think this is something that we need to explore further. In order to achieve the outcomes, the process, the elements can be there. But if the culture is not there, then what sort of IBL would it turn out to be for the students in terms of their experience? Yeah, so I think we have done well. We have looked at why IBL, and we have looked at what constitutes IBL. I think this is a good time for us to pause so that we can take some questions from the audience. So can we have the first question, please? Okay, so the question is asking good questions similar to inquiry-based learning? Could I invite any one of the directors to share, please?
Can I make a first go at it, Andrew?
Yeah, Jeffrey?
I mean, I think really in terms of that, this is often a question that gets raised, you know, that does it just mean that we ask very good questions when doing IBL? I think asking very good questions is a start. And asking very good questions is a very important skill that all of us as educators need to develop, you know, because asking questions that are open-ended, asking real questions that enable students to be able to start the process of IBL and begin to investigate the kind of deep problems that exist within the subject areas will be something that we'll have to develop. And this is, you know, so to some extent, yeah, asking good questions is very much part of IBL, but it's for me, it's a starting point that should lead to the later parts of the process. Thank you.
I think, thank you, Jeffrey, for that. Could I get the other directors to chime in, please?
Yeah, so maybe I'll just add on to what Jeffrey had shared. Remember that I talked about IBL being on a spectrum of teacher-directed all the way to student-directed. And I think really asking good questions is really the start of perhaps teacher-directed IBL. But in part of the process of asking good questions, we also need to look at, for instance, how we can help students think about learning and think about thinking so that they can move along that ladder to be able to ask good questions on their own and to also seek out problems that are meaningful or questions that are meaningful to seek answers to. So it is not really asking questions in a vacuum, but they also understand the context in which they're operating in, and hence, besides someone telling them what to think about, being able to also realize what they need to think about on their own.
Right. Thanks, Lin Yi. Kenneth, what about yourself?
I think the simple, I mean, if we are preparing students for life and for the workplace, we have to ask ourselves is, are students, you know, being able to ask good questions, is that sufficient for them to actually then go out and operate in the workplace? And I think that it cannot be, yes, I mean, the only thing you need to do is actually ask good questions. I think ultimately you can ask good questions if you are employed, you know, but you need to be able to find the sources, right, of information that tell you more about the issue. You need to be able to figure out, after looking at sources, what kind of conclusions can you draw, right? What kind of policies can you draw, right? What kind of solutions can you come up with, right? You need to be able to synthesize that. You need to be able to communicate that. You need to be able to understand actually what's my whole process when I did this. So I think we are saying that actually, if we are really serious about preparing our students for life or the workplace, you need to really have a process where asking good questions is a start, it's a strategy, but it's not, it cannot be the only thing that you do within inquiry.
Yeah, maybe I would want to add on to what Kenneth had just said about, you know, looking at sources and data. I think really, right, data remains as data until you make sense of it and it becomes useful information. And I think that is another very important aspect of inquiry-based learning. And remember the very last part about being able to solution or to communicate your findings. And I think the ability eventually to be able to also make sense and to communicate is a huge part as well, that we have to see how we can bring our students to that stage.
Yeah, I think you all have emphatically stated, that while the start of the IBL process is question driven, but there are many other aspects and elements to it. Also, I thought one of the good points that was brought up was this notion that who asked the question? Does it always teacher-led? Or if we are already doing this well, should we move to student-led? So this is the continuum of IBL that everyone was mentioning in their segments just now. So I think we've kind of like answered this question. It is essential, but it's not the only thing. So having said that, can we have the second question, please? All right, the second question is, I think this is an interesting one. Is ICT essential for IBL? So again, can I invite any one of the directors to start first?
Yeah, so I think you have already seen in my Sparkle Kit example that wasn't an ICT requirement for the IBL to happen, right? Yeah, but honestly, on a more serious note, I think our take on IBL has always been that it has to be fit for purpose and it must be pedagogically sound. And there are things that perhaps we can do with ICT and it enhances the whole experience, whereas there are others that perhaps ICT is not critical to the experience itself. So in the aspects of science, I think a lot of times the tactile learning is really quite important. But beyond that, we also need to look into the future where big data, that's really the future. A lot of our students will eventually move on to do math and science where there is a lot of things that they will require ICT to be on board and to harness the technology to be able to investigate the questions better. So I think really it depends on the context, but it's not necessary, but at many occasions it can actually enhance and make the whole experience even better for the students.
Right. Thank you, Lindy. Yes, Kenneth, looks like you're ready to answer. So, yes.
Ready to answer is I think if there's, I do agree with Lindy. I think it must be fit for purpose. I think if there's technology that's present, but actually a lot of the work actually must be done in person, on site, For example, geographical inquiry. You want to actually look at, how people interact, in a space. You can't, it'd be much harder to actually get it, from data. Sometimes the data, collection must be done by you on site, But I do agree that it really, ICT, opens up possibilities because data sometimes is really available. Big data, that you can't get readily, on site, is actually available for you. So, and you can do that. ICT can also open up other kinds of means. For example, you can collaborate with others, for inquiry because you have different members of the team. And as teachers, it's very hard for students to meet, just to talk about their project. But they can do it collaboratively on a platform, share data, share insights, teachers can look at it, So ICT actually then comes in a big way for that. Yeah.
I mean, if I could,
Jeffrey, please.
Yeah, if I could add to that, I think anyway, earlier, the example that I had given you, to some extent, you could do that without ICT. You can do that in class and purely do it in person. But certainly with the affordances of ICT, it could make the inquiry a lot richer. So for example, you could even explore sources from overseas, even conduct, if you have your contacts nowadays on social media, not so difficult, can even interrogate, in a sense, young people who are not from your culture, from different cultures. So some of the possibilities that ICT give really can be a lot richer. And so I know I saw in some of the questions that you've raised, what about during home-based learning and all these things? Is it possible to do IBL? Certainly, it's just that it will look slightly different compared to what you are able to do in person. I mean, Kenneth earlier talked about geographical inquiry. Of course, in a lot of that, it would make sense to be able to do it, to actually go through the process of doing the investigation. But ICT will be a tool that you can use. But I think Lingy also mentioned it has to be fit for purpose. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, directors. I think if I may just, I like two words that were used. One is a phrase, fit for purpose. So that tells us that IBL is, and this is the second word, that it is an enabler. It enables things to happen. But primarily, it is driven by your content and your pedagogy, right? Your content and your context will shape the pedagogy that you are using, and it is enriched by ICT. So I think in that context, whether we use or not would depend on whether it is fit for purpose and whether we see it as an enabler. So again, going back to Kenneth's example on geography, yes, the tactile experience is absolutely crucial. However, in say the COVID situation, then ICT becomes an enabler. So we must not be driven by the tool, but rather by the intent of why we are doing what we are doing. And once we have that, I think the place of ICT would be pretty well situated in the entire process. Yeah. So we've answered two questions. And before we answer the third questions, this is a call out to the participants here today. I know as good teachers, we all can multitask. So while we listen to the third question and the answer to that, I would appreciate if you could also help us by engaging in word cloud. The question is, in your opinion, what is the value of conducting IBL? So if you could go to mentimeter.com, the code is there. It will also be put on the chat. We hope to hear from you, and we will come back to the word cloud once we finish the Q&A segment. So could we invite the participants to multitask, listen to the question and answer, and at the same time, share with us your view on this matter. With that, can I have the third question, please? Right. How is activity-based learning not inquiry-based learning? What is the difference? Also, direct instruction refers to straightforward transmission of knowledge and skills. I think that's the end of that question. But I think it's quite an interesting question about activity-based and inquiry-based. Are there differences between the two? Right. Would any director like to start first?
I think this one, no choice, I had to start first, right? Because it came from the math framework. although I was hoping that our master teacher Lau Ling can take the question instead. Okay, sure. So I'll have a stab at that. Okay. I'm also thinking on the go. Really, okay, activity-based learning is really, as it suggests, there is some activity that surrounds it, right? And certainly there will be some overlap between activity-based learning and inquiry-based learning. So for example, in the context of the Sparkle Kit, I think that's very clear. However, there will be some instances where you can still do IBL without an activity. So what do I mean? Because IBL essentially is about a very discussion-based kind of engagement and constructivist in nature. So it could really be just centered around a written problem without much activity, but it's really asking for different perspectives, for instance, or asking for some form of analysis on your thoughts on whether that solution is sound or it's not. So it's really more that the process of the inquiry takes precedence over the activity itself. So your main focus is really about how do you have those stages of the inquiry when you are focusing on IBL. You could perhaps have an activity-based learning that is less IBL in focus. So really it's more about the focusing on one aspect of the experience, for instance, right? So maybe in the math and science, it may not be as clear, but activity-based learning is used a lot in food and nutrition, where they do have to go through that process of the tasting and so on. So the tactile experience is very important and part of the learning, but not necessarily always linking back to some question that they wish to answer. Yeah. And I think direct instruction, yes, is transmission of knowledge. So what we are very used to, teacher talk, student listen. Yeah.
Right. Thank you, Ling Yi. I'm also looking at the time. So before I conclude this segment, would Jeffrey or Kenneth like to add in some idea?
Absolutely not for me. I agree with Lin Yi.
Okay. Brilliant. How about Kenneth?
I'm wondering whether the second question, although it seemed a bit incomplete, whether it was actually asking whether there's a place for direct instruction, in inquiry-based, kind of a world. I mean, I will just tell you that actually, I think there's a place for knowledge transmission. I think the knowledge transmission doesn't stop, because there's inquiry-based. I think you need to build up a certain level of knowledge for students to understand before, you really can ask them to go further, push boundaries, understand issues in a deeper level. So I think there is, but I think we are trying to avoid a situation where it's all, knowledge transmission and direct instruction all the time, and direct teaching, and actually no space for inquiry-based. And neither are we saying that it's always just inquiry-based, no place for direct instruction, and that's wrong. So I think it's actually finding that balance and figuring out how do you do that. So some of the activity-based, I'm sure, it's actually about content, knowledge building as well, not just inquiry. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, I think, Kenneth, you hit the point very well, that it is not an either or. It's not I'm doing inquiry or I'm doing direct instruction. It is something that, again, would be coming to the forefront and something being in the background. So I think I saw one of the questions there, what about weaker students, right? Sure, I mean, we need to scaffold, we need to build up, we need to support, but that doesn't mean that they cannot take part in the thinking. So it is about finding a place for direct instruction, and it is providing an opportunity for students to inquire. So maybe all activity, I'm just trying to take a stab at the maths, even though that's not my area. Maybe we can say that all activity is not inquiry-based, but inquiry-based has activity. I don't know whether that helps or not, but because it was mentioned that sometimes it's activity, but there's no question to look at, but if there's a question, it can be achieved through discussion, or it can be achieved through looking at an activity. So thank you for engaging everyone in this Q&A. I think we will move on to the next segment. To do that, can we take a look at the word cloud, please? Okay, so thank you everyone for participating in this. I must say that even with my glasses, there are certain things I can't see, so pardon me if I don't bring it up. But what strikes me immediately is this notion of critical thinking, this notion of engagement, engaging, sparking curiosity, real world context. So I think what is absolutely important here is that there are very good benefits for our students. And some of them are not just within the classroom context, because critical thinking doesn't end when you leave the classroom. The idea of sparking curiosity is to have engaged learning. So I think that looking at the rest, we have words like real world context and our student ownership. I thought that is also an important idea concerning IBL. So we want to thank the participants for doing the word cloud for us. And with that, I think I want to move on to the third question, which is what is the value of IBL? What is the value of doing IBL? And we're looking at it beyond the school or classroom context. For this, could I invite Jeffrey to go first, please?
Okay, yeah. Actually, if you think about, I'm just looking at the slide here. Well, anyway, if you think about language learning, I think if some of you have as much gray hair as I do, you will remember that you learn English language through first aid in English, that kind of thing. But times have changed, and really language changes constantly. And the advent of social media, the internet, has made language changes even more rapid, and really mass media of all kinds is produced, and students have to engage and have to, in a sense, come in contact with these different forms of language. So we really, really need a 21st century kind of approach towards learning. And this is what I think the slide is trying to to get at. And so through our language lessons, I saw in one of the questions, someone had asked, is this also relevant for third language learning? I mean, certainly, because in terms of whatever third language they learn, it also faces the same kind of conflicts or the same kind of changes that the English certainly faces. So in terms of critical and multi-literacies become very, very important, and the pedagogy must reflect this kind of co-construction of learning. Yeah, so IBL is certainly a tool in this. If I can have the next slide. Yeah, and I just wanted to end up this, this segment for me through this illustration to show that there are many different ways in which this co-construction of knowledge can take place. Someone had talked about direct instruction. So there is a place for it. We're not saying that, you know, we do away with it. Certain things are done better through direct instruction, but there's certainly a place for inquiry and different approaches. So, you know, if you look at the illustration, there are different ways of putting together this building, this thing we call knowledge. Yeah, thank you.
Right, thanks, Jeffrey. I think the very important point based on what you just mentioned is this notion that we now have a deluge of information. We are bombarded by information every day. And to navigate that requires a skill set. And I think the way English language is moving would enable our students to then be able to navigate in that context. For Lin Yi, what do you think is the value with regard to maths and science?
I think really it goes beyond the mathematics and sciences. If you look at our students today, and when you talk about, you know, this information overload that they face on a day-to-day basis, right? It goes beyond them being critical thinkers, but also independent thinkers. And besides taking on different perspectives to also formulate their eventual point of view and have a stand on and their own position on where they stand on the issue. Unfortunately, with many of our young, they think they are independent thinkers and they are not quite aware that they are actually being shaped by a lot of things that are around them. So with AI, with a lot of machine learning, you do find that we sometimes end up in an echo chamber where we are fed with articles. If you go onto, I mean, Instagram, Facebook, whatnot, what you are being fed with are things that you are originally already interested in, and it kind of shapes the way that you think. So if you're not quite aware, or you don't have that healthy skepticism, or do not know how some of these technologies work, you might assume that you are thinking independently, but actually you are being shaped in a certain manner and maybe used to some extent to achieve someone else's agenda. And therefore, this whole idea about IBL, should we spend time on it? Should we teach our students to really question and to look at what is around them and to state their position? All the more it is important with the way our world has changed. And to me, it really goes beyond the subject. We should really be looking at this for our students' future.
Right, I think you have very well put it. In fact, you mentioned the key idea, who does the thinking? Do you want someone else to do the thinking for you, or do you want to do the thinking in today's context, where anything can be manipulated so easily? And that brings us very nicely to the humanities. So Kenneth, could we quickly get a key idea with regard to the value of IBL? Thank you.
Yeah, I think very quickly, a few years ago, I actually went for someone's birthday party, and a family friend said, oh, you know, social studies, you know, over the years, seems to be assessing more than just, you know, content knowledge, requires students to actually look at things and think critically. And I told the person, I said, you know, I told my friend, I said, this is needed in the 21st century. You know, you can't just have information given to you and you give it back to the person who has given it to you. It doesn't work that way. You need to have critical thinking skills. You need to be able to think, integrate the sources, look at multiple perspectives. And recently I met someone who was my former student when I first joined the service. He's now, you know, a senior person in the public service. And he was just telling me that in his work, it's very easy to come up with a public policy and just, you know, if you want to build things, you know, you just have enough budget, you can build things. But I said what is important is actually now, you know, always looking at the different perspectives different social human perspectives of why things should or shouldn't be done. And that means understanding different perspectives, looking at different reasons why, and being able to come up with the best solution. And that's what inquiry will always force you to do. Look at different things, just never settle with what you get, and be able to then come up with the best solution that helps to resolve the complex problems that we're in. I think back to Lindy's point, it's a very complex world. It's not a straightforward world. So you need that.
Yeah, I think, again, you have very well articulated that it goes beyond the subject and it provides them with a skill set to navigate the world of today. With that, we have actually answered three very crucial questions. We started with the why, then we looked at the what, and then we looked at the value. But we did not address one area. And that goes back to the poll that we did, and a number of you stated you're not so confident. So just to let you know, the area that we will be providing PD on is how, as teachers, we facilitate inquiry-based learning. Now, information about the PD will be provided to you at the end of this webinar, so please stay on. But I just want to very quickly talk about the design of this particular PD for you. It is tied to the Singapore teaching practice. And you may be asking, why is it tied to the Singapore teaching practice? So if you look at the Singapore curriculum philosophy, it mentions that learning flourishes under 4 conditions, and 2 of which are highlighted there for you. One is learning flourishes when children construct knowledge actively. And I think in today's webinar, we made it very clear that IBL is one way in which students can actively construct knowledge. The second is through the development of thinking skills and disposition. And again, in the session we've had so far, this has been brought up. Different skill sets, different thinking, the ability to take perspectives. So I think that's where we are coming from, that these PD sessions will take reference from the STP. And what we have done is that for these PD sessions, which are going to be subject-based, subject-specific, we will look at only, there are 24 teaching areas, but we will be looking at only a number of them that lend themselves more to inquiry-based learning. So as I mentioned, information about that will be shared with you a little later on. We are coming to the end of this webinar, and very honestly, I want to thank the directors for being really very fantastic in taking on that task of answering the questions. So I would like to give them the last word on what they would like to share with everybody regarding IBL. So could I invite any one of the directors to go first, please?
Yeah, maybe I'll make a start. Basically, just to end off by saying, even before this webinar, I was actually reviewing the keynote speech of for the Literature Symposium in a few weeks' time that our overseas consultant, Professor Sheridan Blau, had sent. And one thing I thought resonated a great deal to me, and I think very relevant for what we're discussing this afternoon. And the one thing he mentioned is, knowledge not earned is not learned. I'll say that again. Knowledge not earned is not learned. So this is very important. Knowledge has to be earned. You know, it's not something which the teacher can just tell the students and something that they will be able to have. You know, and so really IBL is a process through which students can, in a sense, build this knowledge together.
I think, Jeffrey, that's really a beautiful statement. And maybe Kenneth can add on to that.
Yeah, not so sure what to add on to that, but I think everyone should earn and should gain from IBL, from inquiry-based. And that means students, you know, across board. I believe that now we shouldn't prioritize learning, inquiry-based learning for certain types of students, and for other students who say they can't learn. I think everyone deserves, you know, to learn and build the skills, you know, so that they are able to contribute, you know, to think better and to really work better, you know, in the future. So I would just like to encourage all our colleagues, you know, please try and make sure that inquiry-based learning reaches every student in your classroom.
Yeah, I think, Kenneth, you mentioned a very important point about equity, which means that whether they need more scaffolding or less scaffolding, all kids should get a chance to engage in IBL, because that skill set will serve them very well when they leave school. Yeah. So Lindy, you have the last word.
Yeah, so I thought maybe what I will do is I'll just end off with an image. So if we could just have the picture shown on the screen. Now, this was something that was shared with me when I attended a talk with a senior civil servant. And he actually posed this question to ask to all of us there. So he actually asked us, which would you rather be, the cheetah or the gazelle? Right. And I think instinctively, most of us in the room actually thought that we would rather be the cheetah because, the cheetah is strong, it's powerful, it's the predator. But he posed this question and he said that, the cheetah essentially runs after its prey, whereas the gazelle has the task of not knowing what's ahead of it to figure out a path that will get him out of the way of the predators that are pursuing it. And he linked it to Singapore's context today, right? That, as a very small city state with a lot of challenges, we do have to navigate our way out of a very VUCA, uncertain future. And I think we have come to a certain point where we perhaps can no longer emulate what other countries have done. We may need to constantly seek out a new way for ourselves. And essentially our capital is really human capital. And that lies in the future of our students. And therefore, it's so important for us to build them up to be critical and independent learners who are able to find the right questions to ask and to actually find solutions to very tricky interdisciplinary problems. So I thought this was a nice way to emphasize the importance of IBL in our curriculum.
Right, thank you very much for that very well said and using of that analogy. I think it really drives home the point that sometimes big and strong doesn't really matter. It's about how nimble and how quick you are and how ready you are for the unknown and how prepared you are to face that. So tenacity, determination is equally important. And I think IBL builds that up in our students. Right, with that, we have come to the end of the webinar. And it is my job now to thank a whole range of people. So let me start first with our participants. It is really remarkable that we had about 400 people turn up for this session. It is heartening to know. And I hope that you have found this session useful to your learning. And we really thank you for taking time off your busy schedule to be with us today. I really want to have it's a big shout out to the directors. Thank you very much, directors, for being here today and sharing your valuable insights. You are the epitome to me of leadership. You are available. You're willing to take the questions, the hard questions, and you're most importantly, being accessible to all our teachers. So thank you very much for being here with us today. I also want to thank the hard work done by the AST team. These guys are the ones all behind me and in darkness. They are the ones who are really working very hard to make this possible. And I want to thank them for all the good work that has been done. Finally, I want to just encourage all of us that first I mentioned that the PD details will be shared with you immediately after this. But I want to wish all of you every success as you continue to inquire into your own practice about IBL. And thank you, everyone, and have a great day ahead. Thank you, and bye-bye.
Thank you, Andrew, for
facilitating. Thank you. Thank you.
Once again, let us thank the panel speakers for sharing with us today. Now, before we share the information on professional development offerings with you, do help us make these webinars a better experience by filling out this feedback form. Please scan the QR code with your phone to access the form. Your participation is greatly appreciated. Please scan now. Coming up next, a list of IBL courses.